Learning Texas by Champaign, Chapter 3. Texas in the Federal System. While federalism involves the distribution of power between the states and the national government. Although at times there is cooperation between the two levels of government, there has also been nearly constant tensions between the two. Often these conflicts over the proper role of the states versus the national government have been fraught with partisan political battles. Such partisanship in conflicts between the states and national government was common in the Obama administration when Republicans Greg Abbott and Ken Paxton sat in the Attorney General's office. It was during this intense mixture of federalism and political partisanship that the Obama administration put in place the Stream Protection Rule. The rule was designed to reduce the levels of coal waste that surface strip mining tossed into nearby streams. It would have required companies to restore streams and return the strip mined areas to uses that the areas were capable of supporting prior to the mining, and to replant the mined areas with native trees and vegetation. Essentially, the rule updated regulations for surface coal mining that had been in existence for over 30 years. The coal industry opposed the rule. The industry claimed that the rule would create a huge expense for the industry and would cause companies to cut jobs. One of the most vocal critics was Robert Murray, the CEO of Murray Energy, who considered the rule the most expensive regulation of the coal industry that existed. In contrast, environmental groups supported the rule. Appalachian Voices, an environmental group, is estimated that coal companies had buried over 2,000 miles of streams through surface mining since the 1990s, and the group was concerned about the health effects of coal waste in the water. Supporters of the rule claimed that it would improve water quality in about 263 miles of streams each year going forward to 2040. Texas was one of the affected states. Texas is the sixth largest coal-producing state in the country and is the largest producer of lignite coal, a poor-quality coal that is produced through strip mining. Most of the lignite is used in electrical power generation, and it is a major pollutant. Because natural gas is an inexpensive alternative to coal, and there is increased use of wind energy and solar energy in electrical generation, lignite mining in Texas is fast-fading industry. Still, surface strip mining is a significant business in Texas, and Attorney General Ken Paxton decided to sue the federal government over the Stream Protection Rule. Paxton joined the lawsuit against it with 11 other states in filing suit. Paxton said he wanted to give it one last shot prior to Donald Trump becoming president, believing this would be Paxton's last chance to sue over an Obama administration policy. The state's argument in the suit was that the rule had been adopted without participation by the states. It was necessary to sue, said Paxton, because yet again we must fight federal overreach. The rule tramples states' retention of sovereign authority under the 10th Amendment and seeks to destroy an entire industry, displacing hardworking men and women and setting a precedence to disregard states' own understanding of major industries within their borders. The rule went into effect on December 20th, 2016. Exactly 1 month later, Donald Trump was inaugurated as president along with a Republican-controlled House and Senate. Donald Trump, of course, had campaigned on stopping the decline of the coal industry. While Paxton's lawsuit was in the courts, the Trump administration acted. Repealing the rule was an easy way to quickly show the coal industry that President Trump meant to keep his campaign promises to it. Although repeal would not save the declining industry, it would provide it with a boost. On February 1st, 2017, only days after the Trump was inaugurated, the House of Representatives passed a resolution to repeal the rule. The next day, the Senate passed the repeal resolution, and on February 16th, less than a month into his presidency, Donald Trump signed the resolution. The lifetime of the stream protection rule was exceptionally short. With the rule voided, the lawsuit by Texas and other states could be dismissed. There was no longer anything to sue about. Paxton could claim victory, and President Trump could claim an early and easy fulfillment of his campaign promise to revitalize the coal industry. For his part, Attorney General Paxton, putting this partisan battle within the context of federalism, crowded fighting federal overreach and protecting Texas sovereignty, is the cornerstone at my office. During the Obama presidency, Texas sued the national government nearly 50 times, and Paxton was clear in expressing the connection between federalism and partisanship. When he said, "A lot of people are concerned about my mental health now that Obama is leaving office, what is he going to do with this time?" Some people have suggested maybe taking a day off, a week, maybe some counseling. But I want you to know that everything's going to be okay, because I can still sue the city of Austin. There is no doubt that tensions between the state of Texas and other levels of government will continue. What is federalism? Understand the basic of U.S. federal system. Here is the vocabulary word, so you can read it from my notes. Sorry, I had to go outside. The kids are doing chores. Federalism is a system of government in which power is divided between a central government and regional governments. In the United States, the balance between the powers of the states and those of the national government has been the subject of intense political dispute. Since the American Revolution, states have always done much of the routine governance in the United States. State laws provide the regulations for birth, death, marriage, divorce, and most crime and punishment. Most commercial law is regulated by the states, and states manage education, prisons, highways, welfare, environmental issues, corporations, and professions. The many conflicts that have been fought over the proper roles of states versus the national government include disputes over the states' rights to leave the Union, the power of government to regulate business, the implementation of political reforms, and responses to problems of race, poverty, and abortion. The pros and cons of federalism. There are both advantages and disadvantages to federalism. Although federalism has been essential to American government, it has proven enormously flexible in the United States. It has adapted to vast changes in the geographic size of America, to large increases in its population, and to changes in the racial, religious, and ethnic backgrounds of its population. It is also adapted to vast economic changes in the nation. It should be noted that there are degrees of federalism. That is, regional governments can have substantial power in relation to the national government, or they may have quite limited powers. Federalism in the United States, for example, is vastly different now than it was early in the 20th century, when the states had far more power in relation to the national government than they have now. Even though the states have far less power than they once did, the United States is still not a centralized system of government, and there are continuing debates over the strengths and weaknesses of federalism. The sharing of powers means that both the national and state governments have limits on their powers. Attempts to overreach by one government can be checked by the other. These limits can be seen as an advantage because there is no all-powerful government that can intrude upon and potentially restrict the liberties of the people. Of course, advocates of stronger centralized government would make the contrary argument that a decentralized government makes it harder for a government to act in a clear and uniform manner to deal with the problems that are facing people. Advocates of federalism often claim that the best government is the one closest to the people because it will be more accountable and responsive to the people's interest. Those who believe this take the position that the Texas state government is in a better position to know that what Texans need and want from government than a distant national government trying to respond to the needs of all 50 states. An advocate of centralization might respond by pointing out times when the state government was not responsive to the needs of its people, and the federal government had to step in. For example, Texas and some other states had legally imposed segregation, a policy clearly unresponsive to and unaccountable to the needs of its African American citizens. In their efforts to ensure racial equality, it was only action by the national government that ultimately brought in an end to that lengthy era of state-imposed racial segregation. Here's a close-up of that picture. An advocate of centralized government would argue that under centralized government, there could still be national policies that allow flexibility and room for experimentation. National policies do not necessarily have to be uniform throughout the nation, though advocates of centralization would argue that many policies should actually be uniform throughout the nation. For example, it seems more reasonable for Social Security payments to the elderly to be the same throughout the nation rather than for payments to vary significantly or perhaps not exist in some states under the decentralized system. Polling data shows, however, that Texans seem to have a more favorable impression of the direction taken by the state than they do of the national government. The What Do Texans Think feature shows that Texans were asked if they thought the state and the national government were going in the right direction. Based on polling of Texas voters every February from 2013 through 2020, Texans consistently have more positive view of the direction of state is going compared with the direction of the country at large. The consistency more positive view of the direction of the state compared with the nation's seem to provide support for the argument that one benefit of federalism is the state level governance is closer to the people and is preferable to government at national level. Here's the What Do You Think? I hope you can see that. I have a huge glare on my phone, so I'm having to do this the hard way, guys. Sorry. Federalism in the Constitution. Understanding federalism requires an understanding of why the framers shaped the system in the unique way they did. In many ways, the federal system in the Constitution emerged out of the practical decisions made by the framers, who were dealing with an overly decentralized system of government under the Articles of Confederation that was not working. And as we will see, the debates the framers tackled over the state and national power are the ones we continue to face today. Here's the American Revolutionary War. State power under the Articles of Confederation. For several years after the United States won its independence from Britain, the Articles of Confederation gave states the primary role in governance, and the national government was small and had limited powers. Its relative weakness meant that the states functioned as nearly independent entities rather than as a unified nation. By the mid-1780s, the states' diversity and self-serving policies appeared to be splitting the new nation apart. An economic decline in the 1780s worsened the divisions in the country. Daniel Shays led a rebellion of the Massachusetts debtors who attacked towns and burned courthouses, and the new nation seemed on the precipice of revolt. George Washington criticized the state governments for the new nation's problems, saying the state's pursuit of narrow self-interest was making the situation of this great country weak, inefficient, and disgraceful. It was hard for the national government under the Articles of Confederation to act. The Confederation Congress had limited powers, and the rules followed allowed a few states, in some cases a single state, to block congressional action. It took 9 states out of 13 to enact any defense or economic policy. The Congress could not tax, it had to request money from the state governments, and it could not compel payment. By 1786, Congress was broke because states were not paying their share of expenses for the national government. The Confederation also had no executive or court system and could not defend the nation because it could not pay for an army or a navy. Moreover, the Articles of Confederation could not easily be amended because a unanimous vote of the states was required for amendment. By 1786, it was becoming clear that something had to be done to increase the power of the national government. A meeting was held that year in Annapolis, Maryland, that called for a convention of states to meet in Philadelphia. In the following year, to render the Constitution of the federal government adequate to the exigencies of the Union, that call led to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, where 55 delegates met and designed the new Constitution. The federal system under the Constitution. Under the U.S. Constitution, let me go ahead and get this down so you can see that. I hope you can see that. Phone is totally dark, so I hope you guys can read this. Under the Constitution, a federal system was created in which national government was sovereign, deriving its power directly from the American people. One of the most important parts of the Constitution was the Supremacy Clause. In Article 6, that clause provided that the Constitution, federal laws, and treaties were the supreme law of the land. If state laws or state constitutions were contrary to the Constitution, federal laws or treaties, the state laws or state constitutional provisions were invalid. State courts were required to be bound by the U.S. Constitution and federal laws. The Supremacy Clause prevented states from acting in ways that were inconsistent with the U.S. Constitution and national laws, and thus the clause was a unifying national provision that was sorely lacking under the Articles of Confederation. The immediate effect of the Constitution was to increase the national power and to delegate to the national government distinctive powers and responsibilities such as national defense and foreign policy. Individual states were also sovereign, however, deriving their power from the people in their state through state constitutions and having their own separate powers and responsibilities, such as protecting public safety. Under this system, local governments were created by state governments, and their powers are granted and can be revoked by state governments. See Chapter 10. State interests were protected under the new Constitution in a variety of ways, and one of the most important was that each state would equal representation in the Senate. At the same time, state legislators chose the U.S. senators from the state, and so the senators were against the state interest in the national government. States also retained their power to tax and to maintain a militia, and they had commercial powers, such as the power to regulate commerce within states. Several provisions of the Constitution are especially important in understanding the nature of American federalism. Among those provisions are the 10th Amendment, the Elastic Clause, and Full Faith and Credit Clause of the Constitution. The 10th Amendment. In the debates over ratification of the Constitution, there was great concern that the national government had been too powerful and that it ratified the Constitution would foster a centralized tyranny that would destroy the rights of the people and the states. In an effort to alleviate these concerns, the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution in the form of the first 10 amendments. The 10th Amendment, commonly called the States' Right Amendment, provides the greatest support in the U.S. Constitution for protecting states against national power. It says the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. The problem with the amendment is that it does not specify national and state powers. And so rather than to settle conflicts over federalism, the amendment has become a source of conflict over the meaning of federalism. Here is like I said, I have a huge glare on my phone, so I hope you guys can see this. These are the vocabulary words for the chapter. The Elastic Clause. For its part, the national government under the Constitution had taxing authority, military powers, and commercial authority, such as the power to regulate commerce between states. And it had flexible powers that could be expanded in the future through Congress's constitutional power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all the other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States. This provision is sometimes called the Elastic Clause, provides support for implied national powers, and the exercise of implied national powers often comes in conflict with state powers guaranteed by the 10th Amendment. Full Faith and Credit Clause. Article 4, Section 1 of the Constitution contains the Full Faith and Credit Clause, which provides that each state must recognize the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every other state. Congress does have the authority under this provision to pass laws regulating state recognition of other acts of other states. The clause's unifying force in creating a nation out of multiple sovereign states. Generally, the acts of one state are accepted by another. If a couple is married in Arkansas, that marriage is recognized in Texas, and so moving from Arkansas to Texas would not require a couple to marry again in Texas. There are exceptions, however, to one state recognizing the acts of other states. The classic example involved same-sex marriage prior to the Supreme Court's decision in Obergefell versus Hodges, 2015, which recognized same-sex marriage as a constitutional right. Before Obergefell, Hawaii was on the verge of recognizing same-sex marriage, and Congress passed the Defense of Marriage Act in 1996, which allowed states to refuse to recognize the same-sex marriages from other states. One of the main exceptions to the Full Faith and Credit Clause is not congressional action allowing states to reject the acts of other states. It is a vague concept known as the public policy exception. A state may refuse to give full faith and credit to the actions of another state if those actions are deemed against public policy of the state. Ultimately, the public policy exception is determined by the federal courts. Colorado, for example, has legalized the purchase and use of marijuana, but Texas does not have to follow Colorado's lead. Legal marijuana in Colorado is illegal in Texas, as many Texans have learned the hard way. A number of states have entered into reciprocal agreements with Texas, where Texas recognizes their concealed carry permits for firearms, and those states recognize Texas permit. However, a Texas concealed carry permit is not recognized in all states. The position of the states not recognizing Texas concealed carry permits is that concealed carry, at least as legislated by Texas, is against public policy of those states. Early constitutional debates over federalism. Controversy over the exact nature of the federal system has been long-standing. During the nullification crisis in 1833, South Carolina tried to assert the right to veto or nullify national legislation passed by Congress. The prominent South Carolina politician John C. Calhoun, then vice president under President Andrew Jackson, argued that a strong national government was a threat to the sovereignty of states and called for a federal system along the lines of the original Articles of Confederation. When Jackson responded by threatening to use military force in support of federal law, however, South Carolina backed down. Although the national government imposed its will successfully during the nullification crisis, the question of the exact relationship between it and individual states was still open. In spite of the forces of decentralizing, most notably coming from the South, the Supreme Court under Chief Justice John Marshall, 1801 to 35, issued a number of important opinions that promoted national power at the expense of state power. In McCullough versus Maryland, 1819, for example, one issue was whether Congress had the power to incorporate the Second Bank of the United States. Writing for a unanimous court-martial noted that Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution enumerated the powers of Congress. Nowhere in Article 1, Section 8 is specifically found the power to incorporate a bank. However, because a Bank of the United States could be a means to accomplish some of Congress's enumerated powers, such as carrying out the power to borrow money, the court found that Congress did have the implied power to incorporate the bank. Thus, the necessary and proper clause, the elastic clause of Article 1, Section 8, provided a source of implied powers for the national government. Marshall further noted in his opinion that unlike the Articles of Confederation, the U.S. Constitution had no provision that excluded the recognition of implied powers. He even made the case that the 10th Amendment recognized that Congress had implied powers because it said, "The powers not delegated to the United States, rather than the powers not expressly delegated to the United States." This was a vastly important decision favoring national power at the expense of state powers. Another major Marshall Court decision that expanded national power by broadly defining Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce was Gibbons versus Ogden, 1824, which dealt with a dispute over the operation of steamboats in New York waters. Robert Fulton and Robert Livingston obtained a monopoly from New York to operate steamboats in its waters, and they granted a license to Aaron Ogden to operate steamboats between New Jersey and New York. When Thomas Gibbons then obtained a license from the national government to operate steamboats between New Jersey and New York, Ogden went to the New York courts to get an injunction against Gibbons. Marshall wrote that one of the powers of Congress in Article 1, Section 8 was the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states. Ogden argued that such power was limited to the interchange of commodities and did not include navigation, but Marshall broadly defined commerce to include navigation and wrote that interstate commerce cannot stop at the external boundary line of each state, but may be introduced into the interior. While the completely internal commerce of a state could be considered reserved to the states for regulation, he wrote, if commerce was not completely internal to a state, then it was interstate commerce and could be regulated by Congress. The decision providing a broad definition of interstate commerce was to be the primary source of the most important regulatory power of Congress, the power to regulate interstate commerce. Marshall was consistent when deciding cases and expanding the power of the national government and weakening the power of the states. However, he was unwilling to make the Bill of Rights apply to the states as well as the national government, a step that would require ratification of the 14th Amendment in 1868. In Marshall's time, it was unclear that the Bill of Rights was not a restriction on the powers of states. It was intended to limit the powers of the national government. The Constitution was created out of fear of disunity. 75 years after the ratification of the Constitution, an observer of the American federalism would have concluded that it was a failure. America faced a massive rebellion and a bloody civil war. Texas played a major part in the tensions between the North and South that threatened union when Texas sought statehood and was ultimately admitted to the Union as a slave state. Only 16 years after its admission to the Union, Texas seceded and joined the Confederacy. With secession of Southern states came the Civil War, which was in part a struggle over the meaning of the federal system and the proper relationship between the national and state governments. Southern states, including Texas, feared that a national government controlled by northern states would move to end slavery, an institution that the southern states felt was essential to their social, political, and economic way of life. They saw the creation of Confederacy as a movement back to the older system embodied in the Articles of Confederation, wherein the central government in Richmond was weak and the individual states were strong. This vision of a confederation effectively came to a close in 1865 with General Robert E. Lee's surrender to the Union General Ulysses Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse. Here's a picture of that. I hope you can see that. Like I said, I have a huge glare on my phone and can't see anything. And there's the vocabulary word. The Civil War amendments and increased national power. The end of the Civil War brought an era of Reconstruction. With the end of the Civil War, a key constitutional question remained previously unanswered by the Supreme Court. Can a state secede from the Union? In 1869, Texas was a party to the case in which the Supreme Court resolved this question. The case Texas versus White dealt with legality of a bond sale sponsored by the state that had occurred under its Confederate government. In rejecting the legality of the sale, Chief Justice Salmon Chase's opinion stated that the Constitution, in all its provisions, looks to an indestructible union composed of indestructible states. Secession was void and Texas had remained a U.S. state during the Civil War. It had not had a lawful government during the Confederacy, and so the bond sale was void. Additionally, the court ruled the national government could create a government in Texas after the war where no legitimate government existed because Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution provided the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government. Here is the vocabulary words for this section. Three amendments to the Constitution were also ratified in the aftermath of the Civil War. Those amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, are together known as the Civil War Amendments. The 13th Amendment banned slavery and was important after the Civil War in ending slavery as a basis of Southern economy. The 15th Amendment has been used as a source within the Constitution for legislation dealing with voting rights. It has been the 14th Amendment that has had the most dramatic effect on the nature of federalism. However, with the exception of the 13th Amendment, the Civil War amendments had little immediate effect because of an unwillingness in the part of Congress and the President to enforce the amendments, and because of court interpretations that limited the impact of the amendments. However, as time went by, the amendments, especially the 14th Amendment, began to have great significance in guaranteeing civil rights and liberties. The most significant provision of the 14th Amendment states, "Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction to equal protection of the laws." With few exceptions, in the 19th century, the 14th Amendment offered little promise of being a U.S. constitutional restriction on the states. Its importance in this regard began to increase early in the 20th century due to two developments. Number one, the Supreme Court's incorporation of the Bill of Rights into the 14th Amendment, and two, the use of Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment to combat racial discrimination. The incorporation of the Bill of Rights meant that the court ruled that some of the rights guaranteed in the bill are fundamental, so essential they are incorporated, held to be part of in the liberty guaranteed in the 14th Amendment, which states, "Nor shall any state deprive any person's life, liberty," emphasis added, "or property without due process of law." Over the years, more and more rights were found by the court to be fundamental, ones that were held to apply to the states. Most recently, in 2010, the court held that the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms applied to the states. There are now very few rights in the Bill of Rights that have not been held to be fundamental. In the 1930s, the Supreme Court began to use the Equal Protection Clause to chip away at state laws promoting racial discrimination. In 1950, a Texas case heralded the end of segregated higher education. Haman Sweat was denied the admission at the University of Texas Law School because he was African American. He refused to attend a black law school that Texas had set up to provide what the state claimed to be a separate but equal legal education for black Texans. Texas claimed that its provision of the two separate laws complied with the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Equal Equal Protection Clause in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, when it upheld a state requirement of racially segregated train cars in Louisiana. Sweatt's argument was that the blacks' law school was not equal to the University of Texas Law School, but was inferior, and therefore to require him to attend it would deny him the equal protection of laws. The Supreme Court agreed, pointing out that there were vast differences in the facilities as well as differences in the prestigious schools, the reputation of the faculty, the experience of the administration, and the influence of the alumni. While the court stopped short of declaring separate but equal requirements to be unconstitutional, after Sweatt, it was hard to see how the doctrine could survive, and it did not. In 1954, in Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, the Supreme Court unanimously held that segregated public schools were inherently unequal. The doctrine of separate but equal was dead, though resistance of the decision in many states, including Texas, would delay for decades the end of legally created segregation in public schools. Excuse me, here is the vocabulary term. How does federalism work? Describe the major theories and mechanisms of American federalism. There has been a singular theory of how federalism works in the United States. Instead, there have been different ideas about federalism over time and different mechanisms for putting those ideas into practice. Dual federalism. Following the end of Reconstruction and into the early 20th century, the court embraced dual federalism, which was described by political scientist Norton Loose, a layer cake federalism. See Figure 3.1. Like the layers on a cake, the powers of the national government and state governments were largely separate, and one might add, the layer that was the national government's powers and responsibilities was smaller than was the layer that represented the powers and responsibility of state governments. Under layer cake federalism, there was still clear limits to the sovereignty of states. States could not justify national legislation, nor could they secede from the Union. But states had a major role to play in governance that was quite distinct from the role of the federal government. Prior to the late 1930s, the Supreme Court was using dual federalism to strike down regulation of the economy by the national government. Congressional power to regulate interstate commerce was narrowly defined by Congress, was powerless to forbid the distribution of the products of child labor in interstate commerce, and could not regulate aspects of the manufacture of goods, such as monopolies on production or working conditions in factories. Dual federalism has had tremendous effects on Texas. For example, the Railroad Commission of Texas established rules, among other things, limited the number of oil wells that could be drilled on a particular amount of land, and the amount of oil that could be pumped from those wells. Such regulations were seen as a matter for state rather than national regulation until the discovery of the East Texas oil field in 1930, which then was the largest oil field in the world. As a result of this discovery, such overproduction of oil occurred that national legislation was needed to prevent an interstate market in oil produced in violation of state regulations. Dual federalism was also used to prevent national intervention into acts of racial violence in Texas. Because enforcement of criminal laws was seen as a state matter, Texas did pass an anti-lynching law in 1897 that was used to prevent some lynchings by authorizing the governor to call out the state guard. Nevertheless, Texas and other states were remarkably ineffective in preventing lynching. It is hard to identify the precise number of victims, but the Equal Justice Initiative has identified 3,959 lynchings between 1877 and 1950, whose purpose was to enforce racial separation and segregation laws. Of those, 376 occurred in Texas. It was only in the 1960s that national laws began to be used to successfully prosecute those crimes. Here's the figure. I hope you can see that. And there is the vocabulary. Dual sovereignty. Dual sovereignty is not to be confused with dual federalism. Dual sovereignty means that both state governments and the national government have powers to make laws. The national government's power is limited to lawmaking authority granted in the Constitution to the national government. The lawmaking authority of state government is the police power, the power of the states to pass laws to promote the health, safety, and welfare of people as long as state can show it is reasonably exercising its police power. It has the authority to, for example, require businesses to close or people to wear masks in public in order to reduce the spread of the coronavirus. Sometimes the national government passes laws that regulate or forbid actions that are also regulated or forbidden by state laws. In such a situation, the question often becomes whether a person charged with a state crime can also be charged with the same crime under federal laws. That situation happened to Terrence Gamble, who pled guilty to a state charge of violating Alabama's laws against a felon possessing a firearm. Then, the federal prosecutors charged Gamble with the federal crime involving a felon possessing a firearm. Gamble took his case all the way to Supreme Court, arguing that he was being tried for the same crime twice, which was a double jeopardy, and violating that provision of the Fifth Amendment. The court, however, cited 170 years of court precedent in explaining that unlike the United Kingdom, the United States is not a unitary government. Instead, it is a federal system where both the state and national government have the power to pass laws. And so Alabama could prosecute and convict Gamble for the firearm charge, and the federal government could do so as well without any problem of double jeopardy. Here is the key terms for cooperative federalism. Cooperative federalism. With the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 1933 to 1945, when America faced the Great Depression and the World War II, the relationship between the national government and the states changed dramatically. This new relationship was called cooperative federalism, or marble cake federalism, in which the boundaries between the national and state government became blurred. In the initial form of cooperative federalism, national and state governments worked together to provide services, often with the joint funding of programs or state administration of programs, mostly funded by the national government. In fighting the Great Depression, Roosevelt pursued a variety of such programs. The Social Security Act of 1935, for instance, changed the existing system of federalism in a number of fundamental ways. First, it put into place a national insurance program for the elderly, now known as the Social Security, wherein individuals in all states were assessed a payroll tax on their wages, and upon retirement received a pension check. Second, the act put into place a series of state-federal programs to address particular social problems, including unemployment insurance, aid to dependent children, aid to the blind and disabled, and aid to impoverished elderly people. The basic model for these programs was that the federal government would make money available to states that established their own programs in these areas, provided they met specific administrative guidelines. Although the federal dollars came with these strings attached, the programs were state-run and could differ from state to state. This type of funding system was common in the early days of cooperative federalism. The federal grants made using this model were called categorical grants. During the New Deal program period, the idea was abandoned that the 10th Amendment was a barrier to national power, and that the national government could not involve itself in areas that had previously been reserved only to the states. As the Supreme Court case Wickard versus Filburn, 1942, suggested, the regulatory power of the national government under the Interstate Commerce Clause was so broad that there seemed to be no boundaries on national power. National government regulation under the Interstate Commerce Clause even included regulation the wheat grown by a farmer for his personal use. In the 1960s, during the Great Society policies of President Lyndon B. Johnson, a former U.S. Senator from Texas, new programs were added to the Social Security Act. Here's this. I hope you can see this. Here's a picture of this. Here's the vocabulary words. Medicare was established to provide health insurance for the elderly and paid for through a payroll tax on current workers. Medicaid was added to provide health care funding for individuals enrolled in the state federal Aid to Families with Dependent Children, AFDC program. Medicaid's funding and administration were based on the same state federal principles as AFDC and unemployment insurance. The federal government provided funding for approved state programs. Federalism continued to evolve with the passage of civil rights legislation in the 1950s and 60s, when the role of the national government was expanded to protect the rights of minorities. In the process, the national government was often thrown into conflict with southern states, such as Texas, that persisted in trying to maintain a segregated society. After his election in 1968, President Richard M. Nixon briefly tried to reduce the power of the national government and increase that of the states with a program known as New Federalism. Nixon introduced a funding mechanism called block grants, which allowed the states considerable leeway in spending their federal dollars. In the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan adopted Nixon's New Federalism as his own. Block grants became an important part of the state federal cooperation. New Federalism's biggest success, however, came during President Bill Clinton's administration, when in 1996 major reforms were passed that gave the states a significant decision-making role in welfare programs. By the 1990s, liberals and conservatives were in agreement that welfare in America was broken. Replacing the state-federal system with a system of grants tied to the federal regulations and guidelines lay at the heart of the Clinton welfare reforms, the most important since the New Deal. Coercive federalism. In recent years, some national actions have been described as coercive federalism, in which federal regulations are used to force states to change their policies to meet national goals. For example, until 2012, Supreme Court decision involving the 2010 Affordable Care Act, commonly known as called Obamacare, struck down the provision states were threatened with the loss of all Medicaid funding if they did not expand their Medicaid coverage to comply with legislation. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of coercive federalism for states are federal unfunded mandates, which are federal requirements that the state or local governments pay the cost of federal policies. For example, the Federal Americans with Disabilities Act requires that street curbs be accessible to wheelchairs, but the federal government does not pay for the curbs. That cost is passed on to the state and local governments. The Congressional Budget Office reported that from 2006 through 2016, Congress passed 167 laws that imposed mandates on state and local governments, with 27 passed in 2015 to 2016. A study of the costs of unfunded mandates from 1994 to 1998 claimed they would cost states and localities $54 billion. In recent years, however, the cost of unfunded mandates have lessened. No mandate with costs exceeding $77 million has been imposed since 2010. Here is the vocabulary words. Again, my screen is totally black, probably because I'm out in the sun. Along with the unfunded mandates, federal preemption, and another aspect of coercive federalism. Preemption is based on the Supremacy Clause of Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution, which states the Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, shall be the supreme law of the land. Preemption does not force expenditures upon the states, but it does prevent the states from acting in the areas of that the Constitution exclusively reserved to the national government. In 2008, the city of Farmers Branch, Texas, passed an ordinance that prohibited persons who were not citizens or legally in the United States from renting a residence inside the city. Violations of the ordinance were criminal offenses which applied to both the renter and the landlord. The Federal Fifth Court of Appeals struck down the ordinance on preemption grounds, holding that the law interfered with the national government's constitutional power over immigration. The states respond. States have begun to fight back against coercive federalism and centralization of government in general. This has often had a partisan tinge in which Republican-controlled states opposed actions of the Obama administration, and Democratic-controlled states opposed actions of the Trump administration. As coercive federalism became more common, concerns were increasingly expressed in the last few decades of the 20th century, particularly among the Republicans, that the federal government was becoming too strong in the federal system. In response, not surprisingly, a more conservative Supreme Court rethought its doctrines on federalism, beginning in the 1990s, although not dramatically, reinterpreting constitutional law. The court's rulings did begin to place limits on Congress's ability to legislate under the interstate commerce power, and the court resurrected the 10th Amendment as a protection for the rights of the states. There have been several more recent examples of increased pushback by the states against federal power. Numerous state leaders were critical of the Affordable Care Act and refused to initiate the state health insurance exchanges intended under the act or expand Medicaid. Politicians in Texas and elsewhere also criticized what they called Obama administration's weak efforts to enforce immigration laws, and thus states have become involved in aspects of immigration enforcement. State officials in Texas, Mississippi, and Oregon vowed to reject attempts by the federal government to impose new gun laws, and the 10th Amendment is now being used by some jurisdictions in an effort to prevent the federal government from forcing localities to end sanctuary cities and comply with the federal immigration requirements. Reflecting this rebellion against coercive federalism and centralized government, a number of states, including Texas, have filed lawsuits against the federal government, as then Attorney General Greg Abbott put it, in defending such suits against Obama administration policies by his office. When Texas challenges the federal government, it's about more than money. It's about principles, fundamental principles enshrined in the Constitution and recently affirmed by the U.S. Supreme Court. When it said the national government possesses only limited powers, the states and the people retain the remaining government, defending the constitutional principles that have made the United States truly exceptional. That's priceless. Here's the vocabulary word. Independent state grounds. In addition to Supreme Court decisions in recent years that are more favorable to the claims of states versus federal legislation, states do have leeway to expand the rights of their residents through a concept known as independent state grounds. State constitutions can provide a greater constitutional guarantees to a state's citizens than the U.S. Constitution. Independent state grounds are a characteristic of federalism in that states are free to add to the rights guaranteed at the national level. Some states, such as Massachusetts, relied on their state constitutions to invalidate laws against same-sex marriage. Under the U.S. Constitution, Texas's very inequitable property tax-based system for funding public education was held to be constitutional. In 1973, U.S. Supreme Court held that education was not a fundamental right, and so Texas only needed a rational justification, that is, local control of schools, for the funding system to be upheld. However, in Edgewood versus Kirby in 1989, Texas Supreme Court relied on the Texas Constitution to strike down the system on the grounds that it did not provide, quote, what the Texas Constitution commands, i.e., an efficient system of public free schools throughout the state, unquote. In the 1970s, there was a major effort to gain ratification of an Equal Rights Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. It ratified. The key part of the amendment would have stated, the equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Although the amendment was not ratified nationally, in 1972, Texas adopted its own version, the Equal Rights Amendment, which is Article 1, Section 3A of the Texas Constitution. Equality under the law shall not be denied or abridged because of sex, race, color, creed, or national origin. U.S. Supreme Court decisions have provided major protection against sex discrimination under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. However, it is the Texas Constitution rather than the U.S. Constitution that contains an explicit ban. Here's this. Here's the vocabulary word. Current issues involving federalism. Analyze how federalism shapes the key of policy debates today. Federalism is at the heart of political controversies in the United States. Many of the issues on the contemporary political agenda involve often bitter partisan disagreements over the relationship between the states and the national government. Some of those issues of federalism include Texas and involve questions such as state regulation of voting, the Affordable Care Act, immigration, and the effect of the coronavirus pandemic on Texas and its relationship to the nation. State regulation of voting. The Federal Voting Rights Act required pre-clearance by federal officials for states such as Texas that were covered under the act. Those covered states could not change voting procedures such as requiring voter identification laws, redrawing political district boundaries, or changing the times and locations of polling places without getting federal approval. The formula for determining which states were covered under the act was challenged in an Alabama case, Shelby County, Alabama versus Holder. Texas filed an amicus curiae, or a friend of the court, brief supporting Shelby County's claim that the Voting Rights Act went beyond Congress's power and placed substantial enough costs on federalism that it violated the 10th Amendment. Texas brief noted that the act was based on voting conditions in Texas in the distant past. Unlike then, Texas now has bilingual ballots, and the brief pointed out that in every federal election between 1996 and 2004, African Americans in Texas had registered and voted at higher rates than whites, while between 1980 and 2002, Latinos in Texas had registered to vote at higher rates than Latinos in jurisdictions not covered by the act. The remainder of the brief essentially argued that the pre-clearance required created substantial costs to federalism because it had prevented the implementation of the Texas 2011 voter ID law. In 2013, the court issued a 5-4 decision striking down the formula for determining the jurisdiction covered under the pre-clearance requirement, finding the formula was based on decades-old data. The court held that Shelby County was correct in its position that they were too outdated to be valid. Congress could, the court said, draft another formula to cover jurisdictions under the act, but that formula must be based on current voting conditions. The court emphasized two important points about the federal system. 1, all states enjoy equal sovereignty, and 2, under the 10th Amendment, states have broad power to regulate elections. Only exception conditions, it said, such as racial discrimination in voting at the time of the initial passage of the Voting Rights Act, justified intrusion on the equality and powers of the state. The court's view was that the outdated data provided insufficient evidence, such as that such conditions still existed, and thus absent a valid formula to determine which jurisdictions must go through pre-clearance procedures. None had to do so. Given the decision, Texas no longer has to obtain pre-clearance to change aspects of its system of elections. The Affordable Care Act. Since Congress passed and the President Obama signed the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, in 2010, it has been one of the most contentious recent issues regarding federalism. From the beginning, Obamacare has been a partisan issue. When the Senate voted on Obamacare, every Republican senator, except one who did not vote, voted against it, and every Democrat, along with 2 independents, voted for it. In the House, all 178 Republicans who were joined by 34 Democrats, voted against Obamacare. Republicans have consistently opposed the Affordable Care Act since that 2010 vote and have tried to repeal Obamacare over 70 times. Their argument is that Obamacare is too expensive, that it imposes a tax that is harmful federal regulation, and that it is a violation of individual liberty by requiring individuals to buy health insurance. A central argument against Obamacare was that state action regarding provision of health care was preferable to national action. In fact, one major Republican idea that involved an important part of Obamacare was that Medicaid, the health care program for poor persons, which had substantially expanded by the Affordable Care Act, should be converted into block grants to the states. Republicans came close to repealing the act in 2017. President Trump had been vocal in his opposition to the act, which he has called a disaster, and Governor Abbott and Attorney General Paxton have been strong opponents as well. Texas is one of the states that have not taken advantage of a provision of the act that allows the expansion of Medicaid for low-income persons. Although Texas has the highest rate of uninsured people in the country, currently estimated at 18%, with the passage of the Affordable Care Act, the uninsured rate in Texas did drop from 22.1% in 2013 to 16.6% in 2016. The pandemic, along with the attacks on the program and limitations placed in accessing the program by the Trump administration, has caused the uninsured rate to rise in Texas. With the failure of Congress to repeal Obamacare, Attorney General Paxton has taken the lead in using litigation to gain the law's repeal. He explained that while the Affordable Care Act was claimed to be a health care reform, it stopped the 50 states from experimenting with ways to provide health care to their citizens, because with Obamacare, the states needed Congress's approval before proceeding with their own health care policies. By getting Obamacare struck down as unconstitutional, Paxton argued legislators across the country can get back to crafting policies that address the needs and conform with the values of their own residents. Thus claimed Paxton, if California wants to experiment with socialized medicine, let them do it. Texas will focus on maximizing competition and putting choice back into the hands of consumers. Paxton noted, it's time the courts returned control over healthcare to the laboratories of democracy the founders established. Indeed, Paxton wrote, different states had developed different solutions to the provision of healthcare before Obamacare. Massachusetts, for example, had a state-level health plan, much like what was created with Obamacare. In contrast, Texas handled the problem of people with pre-existing conditions by establishing, oh no, it's going to pause here. Let me see. Hopefully you guys can see this. Whoops. Like I said, I can't see any of this, so I hope you guys can. A high-risk insurance pool. Though Paxton did not mention that only 28,000 people signed up for this costly program. Let me go ahead and get that so you can see individual mandate, defund the Obamacare, and that is definitely Ted Cruz. Given the strong Republican opposition to Obamacare, as well as the ideological commitment to state action regarding health care rather than national legislation, Paxton led 19 other states in a federal lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of the entire act. Their argument was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. The major tax legislation of the Trump administration had eliminated the tax for the failure to buy insurance. In 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court had held in National Federation of Independent Business versus Casellas that the payment required from those who did not buy insurance was a tax and was therefore constitutional. Without that tax, Paxton asserted the individual mandate, the requirement to buy insurance, was unconstitutional, and the individual mandate was such a fundamental part of the law that the entire law had to be struck down as unconstitutional. The case Texas versus United States in 2018 was argued in federal district court in Fort Worth before Judge Reed O'Connor. The Trump administration defended only part of the law. It argued that the individual mandate was unconstitutional, and so the coverage for pre-existing conditions, which was tied to the individual mandate, was also unconstitutional. However, argued the Trump administration, the rest of the law, such as unmarried persons being covered under their parents' health insurance until age 26, was constitutional. 16 other states plus the District of Columbia also participated in the case. Their position was that the entire law was constitutional. My goodness. Judge O'Connor agreed with Paxton's argument and struck down all of Obamacare as unconstitutional. He delayed implementing his decision pending the outcome of an appeal before the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. That court held the individual mandate was unconstitutional and asked the district court to assess how much of the law could stand without an individual mandate. Paxton was, of course, thrilled by his initial success before the district court, saying that this case demonstrates that the 2017 repeal of the individual mandate's tax penalty renders the whole mess unconstitutional. Not everyone was so pleased. The California Attorney General commented that the district court decisions is an assault on 133 million Americans with pre-existing conditions and 20 million Americans with pre-existing conditions who rely on the ACA's consumer protections for health care. A group of states led by the California Attorney Generals appealed the Fifth Circuit decision to the Supreme Court. The case pits a California-led group of states against the Trump administration and a Texas-led group of states. The California group's position is that the individual mandate is constitutional, and if not, the rest of Obamacare is still constitutional. In contrast, the Trump administration and the Texas-led group of states has the position that all Obamacare is unconstitutional. The death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the elevation of Amy Coney Barrett to the court increases the likelihood that the Affordable Care Act will be struck down as unconstitutional in whole or partly. There is no question the district court and the court appeals decision were great ideological victories for Texas and the Trump administration. However, if Obamacare is declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, Texas will have to deal with about 1.2 million people who currently receive subsidized health insurance coverage. That state will also have to determine how pre-existing conditions are covered and whether vaccines and physicals will continue to be provided, as well as deciding whether unmarried children are still covered under parents' policies until age 26. Currently, The state has done no planning for action if Obamacare ends, except for a proposal to initiate another high-risk insurance pool for those with pre-existing conditions. Though the incoming Biden administration may be able to shore up the law, at this point, the case can best be seen as an early victory for Paxton and Republicans in the lengthy partisan wrangling over the Affordable Care Act. Significantly, that wrangling has taken the form of a battle over federalism. Should each state decide how to deal with access to health care, or should there be a national solution? Here's this for DACA. Immigration. Another high contentious issue connected to federalism is immigration. During the Obama administration, Texas once again clashed with the federal government over immigration. This time over the question of how to deal with young people who were brought to the United States illegally by their parents. During the Obama administration, the Secretary of Homeland Security established a policy called Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, DACA. DACA offers immigrant youths who came to the United States when they were children relief from deportation. It gives them protection from deportation and a work permit. Not all immigrant youth are eligible. There are detailed requirements for participation in the program. DACA raises a federal issue because several states took the position that DACA was overreach by the national government. With Donald Trump in the White House, Texas took the lead with a group of other states challenging the legality of DACA program. Then on September 5th, 2017, then Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced the government was terminating DACA. Additionally, on September 5th, the acting Secretary of Homeland Security directed that all new DACA applications and related authorizations received after September 5th should be rejected, and applications for renewal of DACA status should be rejected after October 5th, 2017. Here's the Trump administration regarding the border. That decision led to lawsuits where 2 federal district courts stopped the Trump administration's decision to end DACA. The continuation of DACA led Texas and 6 other states to restart their lawsuit, challenging the legality of the DACA program itself. Initially, Texas requested a preliminary injunction to stop the implementation of DACA. The court noted that nationwide, there were an estimated 1.5 million people, or 1,500,000 people, who were potentially qualified for the DACA program, and 800,000 had applied for and been accepted into it. Texas alone had about 100,000 DACA recipients. Because of such widespread impact on people and the fact that the program had been in existence since 2012, the judge decided it was not in the public's interest to issue an injunction and terminate the program at that point. In evaluating the arguments favoring the opposing the DACA program, the judge made it clear that he believed the plaintiffs, those opposed to the program, would win at trial. The fundamental argument of the defendants was that the DACA program was an exercise in administrative discretion, that is, enforcement of immigration laws was focused not on children, but on other groups of immigrants, such as persons who came to the United States as adults. They argued that if, for example, a police officer has the legal discretion to give someone a warning rather than a speeding ticket, immigration officials also have the discretion to focus on immigrants other than those who came to the United States as children. The judge, however, supported Texas' argument that the DACA program was an overreach of executive power. Congress had made no provision in its immigration laws for the administration to award huge numbers of people a lawful presence in the United States and work authorization. The judge wrote, if the nation truly wants to have DACA program, it is set up to Congress to say so. Although the judge's thinking in this case did not bode well for the future of the DACA program, without congressional action, the case was put on hold of another DACA-related case. On June 18, 2020, the Supreme Court decided that the Trump administration had failed to follow proper procedures in ending DACA by not providing adequate reasons for their actions. The decision does not mean that the DACA program cannot be ended, only that the administration must give sufficient justification for doing so. The coronavirus in Texas and federalism. The coronavirus, Texas, and federalism. The coronavirus pandemic was an enormous shock to the American political system. And in only a few short months, it decimated the economy of Texas and of the nation. It also drastically changed the relationship between the states and national government. As the disease spread, it caused a new form of federalism to emerge, one imbued with intense political partisanship, but also a hybrid of several different models of how the states and national government interact. Cooperative federalism played a major role in the initial response to the health and economic crisis brought on by the coronavirus in such programs as Medicaid and unemployment insurance. In the spring of 2020, the national government assumed a larger financial role in paying for health care and underwriting unemployment insurance. These funding initiatives ran against the grain of prior Trump administrative policies, cutting back federal involvement in health and welfare programs. Despite the enormous federal investment, state and local government budgets were strained to the breaking point by the pandemic, and the sums provided to the states were not sufficient for the states most ravaged by COVID-19. The ideas underlining new federalism also found a prominent role in the Trump administration's arsenal to combat the economic catastrophe. The various coronavirus bailouts targeted at smaller businesses and higher education, particularly state institutions of higher education, are powerful examples of the federal government directly transferring monies to organizations at the state and local level and leaving considerable discretion as to who might receive these emergency funds. One also sees elements of coercive federalism in the response to the pandemic, particularly in President Trump's efforts to pressure the states to agree to a timetable for reopening the economy. Although President Trump initially claimed that the federal government was a backup to the states and the onus was on the states' governors to deal with the pandemic, he asserted that he had total authority to nullify state and local restrictions and to open the economy. Reactions to that claim was so strongly negative that the president then stated governors will be empowered to tailor an approach that meets the diverse circumstances of their own states, while telling governors that they were going to call your own shots. He did emphasize that federal government would be involved to support states in reopening the economy, and the administration released guidelines on when the economy should be reopened. The president opposed restrictions The president opposed restrictions imposed by several Democratic governors and supported protest against those restrictions, showing that governors would not call their own shots, free from critical treatment by the national government. One of the most unusual forces about the early governmental response to the coronavirus was the articulation of strategy that almost seemed to revive major aspects of the federal dualism model. Through most of February, March, and April, the Trump administration appeared to argue that the responsibility for providing health care was primarily a state and local responsibility, not a national one. The business of acquiring testing kits, ventilators, and protective equipment for healthcare workers was left to the states, who were encouraged to go out into national and international markets to get what they needed. The failure of Congress to agree to another coronavirus aid package in September and October 2020, in effect, also left substantial responsibility to the states for further responses to the pandemic. Essentially, the response to the pandemic has created a hybrid system of federalism that is more complex than previous models of state-national relationships. Federalism and the future of Texas. It has been a frequent refrain for Texas politicians to want the states to have greater power. Their argument is that national government is too distant, controlling, expensive, and unresponsive. With Republicans in control of Texas statewide offices, especially the office of the governor and the attorney general, the Obama administration was frequently challenged in the courts in voting rights, health care, and immigration. Texas' position was one that promoted state over national power. With the Trump administration, Texas found an ally for its state power argument. The pandemic, however, complicated the dispute between state versus national power. While Trump administration tended to be differential to the states in responding to the pandemic, that was not always the case. For example, the Trump administration pressured states for a rapid reopening of the economy. It also became clear that there were limits to the states' abilities to deal with the virus, and at least to some degree, it was clear there was a need for national response that was far more than funding efforts to deal with the disease. What the future holds for federalism is unclear. Will this hybrid system of federalism, combining aspects of cooperative, coercive, new federalism, and dual federalism, with the states in front line and the role of the national government generally functioning as a source of funding, continue beyond the pandemic or beyond the Trump administration? While that remains to be seen, it is clear that in the highly polarized political environment of modern America, many of our political controversies will be framed as battles over federalism. This is the end of Chapter 3.